Your hands are shaking. Not from cold, you're at 15,000 feet over New Guinea, and it's 90 degrees even up here. You're shaking because you can see them now. 15? 18? You lost count. Japanese fighters, filling the sky below you like a swarm someone kicked open. You're 22 years old. You are not even supposed to be in this cockpit. This isn't your squadron. You talked your way into someone else's fight 3 days after Christmas because you couldn't stand waiting anymore. Every pilot who taught you to fly told you the same thing about that silver plane down there. The Zero. It turns tighter than anything you own. It climbs like it's got no weight at all. Men you trained with are dead because they tried to turn with one. So you're not going to turn. Captain Lynch's voice cracks over the radio. 4 of you, 15 of them, maybe more. You push the stick forward. The horizon flips. You are diving straight into the middle of them, and every instinct in your body is screaming to pull up. You don't pull up. The plane Richard Bong is flying does not officially belong to him. Neither does the war. Not yet. Not really. He is 22 years old, a second lieutenant, the son of a Swedish immigrant, raised on a small dairy farm outside Poplar, Wisconsin, a town so small that most maps don't bother naming it. He is the kind of young man who says little and means all of it, quiet on the ground, almost unrecognizable in the air. To understand why he is diving into 18 enemy fighters on the day after Christmas, 1942, you have to go back, not weeks, years, because the story of this moment did not begin over New Guinea. It began with a single terrifying fact that every American pilot in the Pacific already knew in his bones. The Japanese Zero could not be beaten, not fairly, not by the rules anyone had been taught. When Japan went to war at the end of 1941, its naval fighter was something close to a work of art, light, almost fragile, and that fragility bought it something no Allied aircraft could match: agility. It could turn inside a circle no American fighter could follow. It could climb at an angle that seemed to defy its own engine. A skilled pilot could slide onto an enemy's tail and simply stay there, patient, until the kill came. And the men flying it were not amateurs. They were veterans, hardened over years of combat in China, then carried across the widening war to Pearl Harbor, to the Philippines, to Malaya, as far as the coast of Australia. For 13 straight months, they had never once met an equal. Allied airmen spoke of the Zero the way sailors once spoke of sea monsters. Something close to superstition, a machine that could not lose. Pilots flown by men who never seemed to make a single mistake. That reputation was not entirely earned, but in 1942, almost no one on the American side knew how to prove it. American pilots learned the truth, the only way war ever teaches anything in blood. Flying Bell and Curtiss fighters, the P-39 and the P-40, they went up against the Zero, the way fighter pilots had always fought. Since the first war in the sky, 20 years earlier. Close the distance. Turn. Outfly the other man. Turn with a Zero, and a Zero will settle onto your tail, and then it will kill you. There seemed to be no way around it. No clever maneuver. No trick of engineering. Just survival, when it came at all, by luck or by weight of numbers. And underneath the losses was something worse than casualties. A kind of quiet, spreading defeat, the belief, shared by men who had never even seen a Zero up close, that the fight was already lost before it began. Because courage flown into a losing turn produces only one outcome: brave men, dead men. The thing that had to change was not the pilots, it was the fight itself. A few men had already started to see it. In China, an American named Claire Chenault had reached the same conclusion through hard experience of his own. Never turn with the enemy. Dive on him from above. Fire once. Dive away. Trade the turning fight for speed and height. It was the right idea. But his pilots flew P-40's aircraft that could dive well enough to strike, but could not climb back to altitude fast enough to strike again. One good pass, and then they had to run. What the war still needed was a machine that could do both, strike from above and climb straight back to altitude to do it again. That machine had already been born, just not for this reason. Years earlier, on a drawing board in Burbank, California, a young engineer named Clarence Johnson, the kind of man the whole aviation industry would come to know simply as Kelly had set out to build something that had never existed before. Not to beat a Japanese fighter nobody in America had even heard of yet. The requirement, written back in 937, called for something else entirely. A high-altitude interceptor, faster than anything flying. To answer it, Kelly Johnson did something almost nobody else was doing. 2 engines on a single fighter, at a time when fighters carried one. Twin-tail booms to house them. Turbo superchargers to keep their full power at altitudes where ordinary engines simply gave up and gasped. The result looked like nothing else in the sky. A fighter with 2 engines and 2 long tail booms, the pilot seated alone in a narrow pod between them. In 1939, the prototype crossed the entire United States in a matter of hours, announcing to anyone paying attention that something genuinely new had arrived. They called it the Lightning. Over the vast, merciless distances of the Pacific, that second engine meant something the designers had never fully imagined. A pilot who lost one engine hundreds of miles from the nearest airstrip could still limp home on the other. A great many of them would. The Lightning could reach speeds near 414 miles an hour, a number the Zero could never touch. It could climb above 40,000 feet, and in its nose, packed tightly together, it carried one 20-millimeter cannon and 4 heavy machine guns, all firing dead, straight ahead in a single, concentrated stream. That last detail mattered more than it seemed to. Most fighters carried their guns out in the wings, angled inward to converge at one exact point, somewhere ahead of the aircraft. Deadly at that single range, scattered everywhere else. The Lightning's guns sat right in front of the pilot's own eyes, and their fire stayed lethal from point-blank range to well beyond where a Zero's own light weapons could even reach. A P-38 pilot could open fire, while the enemy was still out of range to shoot back, and slung beneath its wings, drop tanks gave it something no single-engine fighter in the theater could offer. Reach hundreds of miles of it. But an aircraft, however brilliant, is still only half the answer. What Kelly Johnson had built in Burbank meant nothing without a second decision, one made not on a drawing board, but inside the mind of every pilot who would ever climb into that narrow cockpit. They would have to stop trying to turn with the Zero, completely, permanently. No exceptions, not even in the heat of the moment, when every instinct screamed otherwise. Instead, they would fight in the vertical, climb above the enemy, dive down out of a height he could not follow into, fire once in a single slashing pass, use the speed of that dive to climb straight back up, out of reach, before he could ever turn to answer. Strike from above, never stay to turn. It was the exact reverse of everything a fighter pilot had ever been taught. And against the Zero, it would prove to be murderous. The logic beneath it was almost cruelly simple. A Zero could outturn a Lightning every single time, but it could not follow one down. Pushed into a fast dive, the light Japanese fighter shuddered, its controls seizing up, threatening to tear the whole airframe apart. The heavier Lightning, in the same dive, only gathered speed. A Zero could not climb after a Lightning that had already traded speed for altitude. It could never catch one whose pilot simply chose to leave. Height was energy, stored and waiting. Speed was energy, already spent. And the Lightning was a machine built to turn one into the other, and back again, at will. The pilot who held onto that discipline held every card in the deck. He chose when to strike, and he chose when to leave. There was nothing the finest dogfighter in the world could do about a fight he was never allowed to have. The hardest part was never the flying. It was the discipline, the constant, unnatural refusal of the oldest instinct a fighter pilot carries: the pull to stay, to finish what you started, to turn just once more and end it. Because the same lightness that made the Zero the finest turning fighter on Earth had also made it something else: fragile. To be that nimble, it carried almost no armor around its pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks to survive a hit. A single solid burst from the Lightning's concentrated guns could tear it open in a way its own pilot would very rarely walk away from. Every Zero a Lightning caught in a diving pass was not just a machine destroyed. It was very often a trained pilot killed, and trained pilots were the one thing Japan could least afford to lose. This was the world Richard Bong stepped into in September 1942, not as a finished fighter pilot, but as a promising, reckless young officer, still learning exactly what kind of war he had signed up for. Months earlier, back in California, he had already shown both halves of what he was: the instinctive gift and the disregard for the rules that so often rides alongside it. In June that year, flying low over the Bay Area, he had looped his fighter around the towers of the Golden Gate Bridge and buzzed low enough over the streets of San Francisco to send papers flying off office desks. He was grounded for it, dressed down hard by the general in command of the 4th Air Force, a man named George Kenny. It could have ended his career before it began. Instead, when Kenny shipped out that September to take command of the 5th Air Force in the Pacific, he remembered the reckless young pilot who could throw a fighter around the sky like almost no one else he'd seen. He took Bong with him. Bong was assigned to the 9th Fighter Squadron, 49th Fighter Group, but the squadron's own P-38s had not yet arrived. So while he waited, he and a handful of others were sent forward to New Guinea, attached temporarily to the 39th Fighter Squadron, 35th Fighter Group, just to gain something the classroom could never teach: combat experience. The man leading that squadron was Captain Thomas J. Lynch, a calm, exacting Pennsylvanian, already becoming one of the first true masters of the Lightning's new way of fighting. Under Lynch, the borrowed pilots learned the vertical game the only way it could be learned: by flying it again and again against an enemy who did not yet understand what was happening to him. Below them, on the ground, and in the cockpits of their own aircraft, the Japanese pilots had no reason to expect anything different from the twin-tailed shape they had started noticing over New Guinea in recent weeks. Some of them took it for a reconnaissance aircraft, too large, too strange, surely not built for real air-to-air combat. The possibility that the Americans had built a fighter specifically designed to take the Zero's single greatest strength, its agility, and turn it into a weakness, had occurred to almost no one on the other side of this war. That is the moment Richard Bong is flying into on December 27th, 1942, not as a finished ace, not yet a legend, just a 22-year-old lieutenant borrowing someone else's fight, about to find out in the space of a few violent seconds whether an idea born years earlier on a drawing board in Burbank could actually survive contact with the enemy it was built to kill. The order comes over the radio in 4 words: dive, attack, climb away. Captain Lynch says it like a man reciting something he has already said to himself 100 times in the quiet hours before a mission, until the words stopped sounding like a command and started sounding like a prayer. Below them, spread across the sky over WWII like a net someone has thrown open, are somewhere between 15 and 18 Japanese aircraft, fighters, bombers, moving in loose formation toward the beachhead at Buna, where American and Australian troops are fighting a brutal, disease-ridden campaign through jungle and swamp that will later be remembered as one of the costliest of the entire New Guinea War. 4 P-38 Lightnings, 4 American pilots, one of them 22 years old, flying a fight that technically belongs to someone else. Richard Bong pushes the stick forward. The horizon disappears. Here is what almost no one watching from the ground can see: the physics of it, the invisible arithmetic that decides in the next few seconds who lives and who does not. A zero, down there in that formation, can turn inside a circle no American fighter has ever matched. Every pilot in this war has learned that lesson already, most of them from watching a friend die learning it. But a zero cannot do the one thing a lightning is about to do to it. It cannot follow a fast dive. Pushed past a certain speed, its light airframe begins to shudder. Its controls stiffen, grow heavy, until the stick in a Japanese pilot's hands feels like it is set in concrete. The very lightness that makes it deadly in a turn becomes, in a dive, something closer to a warning. Slow down or come apart. Bong is not slowing down. The altimeter unwinds. The airspeed climbs past anything a zero could safely match, and somewhere below him, in the cockpit of an aircraft he cannot yet see clearly, a Japanese pilot, a veteran, most likely, hardened over years of fighting in China, a man who has never once in this war met an American he considered his equal, looks up and sees something coming down out of the sun that his own machine was never built to answer. He fires. The burst is short, controlled, exactly the way he has been trained. Over months of drills that felt, at the time, almost pointless, because who disciplines himself not to finish a kill, not to turn for one more pass, when every part of him is screaming to do exactly that? A zero falls away, trailing smoke. There is no time to watch it fall, because the same discipline that let him take that shot now demands the harder thing. The thing that separates a pilot who survives this war from one who does not. He does not turn to confirm it. He does not linger to make sure. He keeps his speed, uses the ferocious energy already stored in his dive, and pulls back on the stick climbing, fast, away from the swarm he has just torn through. back up into the one place a Zero cannot follow. Behind him, a second target, a Nakajima Ki 43, the Oscar, faster and nimbler than a bomber, still no match for what is coming down on it from above. Another burst, another aircraft falling out of formation, spinning toward the jungle canopy below. 2 kills, in less than the time it takes to describe them. And Bong is already climbing back to altitude, back to the only place in this fight where he is safe. Around him, the other 3 lightnings are running the same pattern. Dive, fire, climb, not chasing anything, not staying to finish what a lesser instinct would call unfinished business, because this is not a dogfight. It was never allowed to become one. By the time the formation breaks apart, the surviving Japanese aircraft scattering, some diving for cloud cover, most simply turning for home rather than staying in a fight they cannot win. The 4 Americans have shot down 7 enemy aircraft, 7 against 4. Not one lightning is lost. Somewhere in Japanese Naval Air Command, word of this engagement will eventually filter back through after-action reports, and it will not be received the way a man might expect a defeat to be received. Not with alarm, not yet, with something closer to confusion. For 13 months, the story of this war in the air has had exactly one shape. The Zero attacks, the Zero turns, the Zero wins. This new report does not fit that shape at all. An enemy aircraft, twin-tailed, strange-looking larger than any single-engine fighter, should be attacking from altitudes their own pilots cannot easily reach, striking once and then simply climbing away before a proper fight can even begin. Some officers will file it as an anomaly, bad luck, an unlucky formation caught by surprise. They will be wrong, and the cost of being wrong will not become fully clear to them for many months, not until the losses stop looking like anomalies and start looking like a pattern that repeats itself, mission after mission, across every stretch of sky over New Guinea. Because here is the truth almost no one on the Japanese side has fully grasped yet. Every veteran pilot lost in one of these engagements is a man who cannot truly be replaced. Japan's training system, however demanding, however proud, was never built to produce pilots at the volume this war is about to demand. Each name lost to a diving lightning represents years of hard-earned skill that simply cannot be regrown in time, while the man who killed him is one of thousands still training back home in American classrooms and airfields that have barely begun to reach full capacity. For Richard Bong, none of that arithmetic is visible yet, not from inside the cockpit. What is visible is simpler, and in some ways heavier. 2 aircraft, 2 men, almost certainly, who will not go home. He does not celebrate. Pilots who flew alongside him in these early months would later describe something almost strange about him. A young man who could do the deadliest work in the theater and carry it afterward like a burden rather than a trophy. He rarely spoke about kills in terms of pride, more often in terms of luck, of getting close enough that he could not miss, because his own aim, he always insisted, was nothing special. It was proximity, not marksmanship, he would say, getting near enough that missing simply wasn't an option. That kind of humility in a man who was just shot down 2 aircraft in a matter of seconds unsettles some of the pilots around him more than confidence would have. But there is no time on this particular afternoon for reflection. The formation reforms. Lynch leads them home, back toward Port Moresby, engines running steady, fuel gauges lower than any of them would like. This engagement small in the scale of the whole Pacific War, 4 aircraft against 15 or 18 will not decide anything on its own. But it proves something that no amount of testing back in California, no amount of theory scratched onto a chalkboard by engineers who had never faced a zero in the air could ever fully prove. The idea works. Refuse to dogfight. Fight only in the vertical, and the zero, the same aircraft that has haunted Allied pilots for 13 straight months, the machine whole squadrons had learned to fear on sight, begins for the first time to look beatable, not because it has changed, because the fight itself has changed, and it can no longer answer. In the months that follow, this same pattern repeats itself across New Guinea again and again, until it stops being an exception and starts being the war itself. March 1943. A Japanese convoy troop transports and their destroyer escorts, carrying reinforcements toward the desperate fighting near Ley steams into the waters north of New Guinea. Lightnings fly top cover above the American bombers sent to intercept it. When Zero escorts climb to meet them, they meet exactly the fight the Americans have been building toward for over a year. Not a turning fight, a vertical one, fought on American terms, at American altitude, at American speed. The bombers reach the convoy below, almost untouched. 8 transports and 4 destroyers go to the bottom of the sea in an engagement that will be remembered as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, and with them thousands of Japanese soldiers who never reach the fighting they were sent to reinforce. The resupply of New Guinea by sea effectively ends there. In the cold arithmetic of an air battle, most of the men on those transports below never even saw coming. And then, the following month, the same idea: refuse the close fight. Strike from a place the enemy cannot follow, is carried further than anyone in this war has yet dared to carry it. American codebreakers intercept and decrypt the travel schedule of a single man. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, architect of the strike on Pearl Harbor, the most admired officer in the entire Japanese Navy. For a few hours, on the 18th of April, 1943, his exact location will be known. The distance to reach him is more than 400 miles of open ocean, far beyond anything an ordinary fighter could hope to fly and still have fuel left to fight, let alone return home. Only 1 aircraft in the theater can even attempt it. 16 P-38 Lightnings, led by a navigator named Major John Mitchell, fly the entire distance at wave-top height, in total radio silence, holding their course by dead reckoning across 2 hours of featureless ocean, with no landmark to check against and no room anywhere for error. Mitchell's timing proves almost exact. At nearly the precise minute he predicted, 2 Japanese bombers appear ahead of them, carrying the admiral and his staff, screened by 6 Zero escorts. A small element of the American formation breaks off and drives straight in. Lieutenant Rex Barber presses his fire into the lead bomber and sends it down, burning into the jungle below. The man who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor dies in the wreckage. 1 American aircraft does not return. Set against that cost, the mission is judged by every measure a commander could name to be among the most efficient single strikes of the entire war made possible, only because 1 aircraft in the whole Pacific theater had the range, the speed, and the discipline to reach a man 400 miles away and never once need to turn and fight for it. For the Japanese pilots still flying against this new kind of war, month after month, the effect runs deeper than the losses themselves. They began this war as the finest fighter pilots on Earth, sure of their machine, sure of their skill, sure, in a way that bordered on something close to certainty, that no enemy anywhere could match them in a turning fight. Now they fly against an enemy they cannot reach, cannot catch, cannot draw down into the one kind of combat where their years of training and their aircraft's extraordinary agility would still mean everything. And that distinction matters, because the Japanese pilots are not suddenly becoming worse. Many of them are still extraordinarily skilled. Some have been flying combat missions since long before the Americans they face had even graduated from flight school. They know exactly how to use a lightweight fighter. They know how to tighten a turn until an impatient opponent drifts directly across their guns. They know how to conserve energy at low speed, how to read another pilot's intentions from the angle of a wing, how to wait until a man makes one mistake. Against an opponent willing to play that game, those instincts remain lethal. The problem is that the lightning refuses to cooperate. Imagine being one of those Japanese pilots. You see the twin-tailed aircraft high above you. You know that if you can bring him down into your altitude, if you can force him to turn once, and then once more, the advantage may become yours. So you wait, you watch, and the American stays high, thousands of feet above the formation, sometimes difficult to see against the glare, carrying more speed and more potential energy than anything below him. Then one of the lightnings rolls over, the nose drops, and patience becomes violence. The aircraft that seemed almost motionless above you is suddenly falling through the sky at a speed your own fighter was never designed to match. There is barely time to react. A warning over the radio, a wingman beginning to break, a flash of sunlight from the American's wings, then the guns open. 4 heavy machine guns and a cannon concentrated in the nose, firing straight along the pilot's line of sight. One short burst. Then the lightning is already past you. You turn after it. Of course you do. Every instinct says follow. But that is exactly what the American wants you to try. For a few seconds, it feels possible. Then the distance stops closing. The P-38 is still climbing. Your own aircraft begins to lose energy. Speed falls. The nose grows heavy. And while you are staring at the first lightning, another one may already be above you, watching, waiting. The hunter becomes the target before he understands that the roles have changed. That is what makes this kind of fighting so psychologically destructive. A duel can be understood. A pilot can lose a duel and still tell himself the other man was simply better. Perhaps he turned sooner. Perhaps he judged the distance correctly. Perhaps next time will be different. But there is something far more difficult to accept about an enemy who never gives you the opportunity to test your greatest skill at all. The Zero pilot cannot prove that he is better in a turn because the Lightning pilot refuses to turn. He cannot use patience because the attack lasts seconds. He cannot chase because the P-38 is faster. He cannot climb after it because the American has already converted the speed of his dive back into altitude. The battle begins to feel less like fencing and more like being struck by something falling out of the sky and then waiting for it to happen again. That waiting matters. On long missions over New Guinea, hours can pass with almost nothing happening. Engine noise, heat, clouds, ocean, jungle. A pilot scans the horizon until his eyes ache. But once the lightning establishes its reputation, the most dangerous direction is no longer ahead. It is above. Every patch of sunlight becomes suspicious. Every distant reflection might be aluminum. Every small shape crossing the sun causes the body to react before the mind has even decided what it is seeing. The Americans begin to understand this too. Altitude becomes more than a tactical advantage. It becomes pressure. A group of P-38s visible high overhead can influence Japanese pilots before a single gun is fired. Climb toward them, and you burn fuel and give up the altitude, protecting the bombers below. Stay low, and you accept that the lightnings may attack whenever they choose. Break formation, and the aircraft you are supposed to protect become vulnerable. Remain together, and you present the Americans with a concentrated field of targets. There is no perfect answer. Every decision costs something. That is, the larger change taking place over New Guinea. The P-38 is not simply destroying aircraft. It is beginning to control decisions. And air combat, like every other kind of combat, is often decided before the shooting begins by which side is forced to react. The Japanese had spent the opening year of the Pacific War doing exactly that to everyone else. At Pearl Harbor, over the Philippines, across Malaya, across the Dutch East Indies, their opponents reacted. Their opponents defended. Their opponents looked upward and wondered where the next attack would come from. Now, over New Guinea, the direction of that fear is beginning to reverse, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably. Captured letters and post-war accounts recorded years later describe something that reads less like fear of a specific enemy and more like a slow, grinding exhaustion. Men scanning the sun above them, hour after hour, mission after mission, waiting for a twin-tailed shape to fall out of the light before they even have time to react. The confidence that carried Japanese naval aviation across half the Pacific in the opening year of this war does not disappear all at once. It drains slowly, mission by mission, kill by kill, until there is very little of it left. Richard Bong's own war continues in exactly the pattern that began over Dobodura. Climb, choose a target, dive, fire from close range, closer, often, than caution alone would suggest, because he trusts proximity more than he trusts his own aim. Climb away, before the fight can ever become anything else. There is very little elegance in it, not in the romantic sense people later attached to fighter aces. Bong does not need to circle an enemy for minutes, waiting for some perfect duel to unfold. He does not need to remain behind a fighter until one of them finally runs out of ideas. Whenever possible, he attacks from a position where the enemy has almost no useful response. Above, behind, out of the sun. He gets close, sometimes dangerously close. Then he fires. That is where the lightning's nose-mounted weapons become devastating. The guns are not scattered along the wings. There is no need to wait for the target to reach one precise convergence distance. Where the nose points, the entire battery points. Bong can carry that concentrated fire directly toward the aircraft, filling his windshield. Then he leaves, again and again. Described afterward, the method sounds almost mechanical. Climb, find, dive, fire, climb. Inside the cockpit, there is nothing mechanical about it. At hundreds of miles an hour, 1 second becomes an enormous distance. Fire too late, and the target disappears underneath you. Pull out too late, and the jungle itself becomes the thing that kills you. Climb too aggressively, and you throw away the speed protecting you. See another target, become greedy, turn toward it, and suddenly the entire advantage disappears. That is why the true weapon is not simply horsepower, it is restraint. Courage tells a fighter pilot to stay. Discipline tells him to leave. On the ground, the distinction sounds almost trivial. In the air, it can separate the men who return from the men whose names are read from a list that evening. Bong understands that contradiction better than most, and it is a contradiction. Almost nothing about him suggests natural caution. This is still the young pilot who once flew low enough over San Francisco to get himself grounded. The same pilot who seems happiest when an aircraft is being pushed close to the edge of what someone else considers reasonable. But combat begins teaching him where aggression matters. He can be aggressive in the dive, aggressive in choosing the target, aggressive in how close he gets before pulling the trigger. But once the guns fire, the argument is finished. The lightning climbs. No second thought. No need to prove anything. No prideful turn back toward an enemy who survived the first pass. That may be the strangest thing about the man who will become America's highest-scoring ace. Part of his success comes from learning exactly when not to fight, and the lesson spreads. Pilots, arriving in the theater, begin hearing the same rules until the words become part of the culture of survival. Never turn with a zero. Keep your speed. Keep your altitude. Protect your wingman. Do not allow the enemy to choose the shape of the battle. The rules have to be repeated because instinct must be rewritten. A fighter pilot's natural impulse is to point the nose toward the enemy and stay there. The lightning demands something colder. Attack only when the geometry is right. If it is wrong, climb away. If the enemy refuses to offer a safe attack, leave. If another target appears, but reaching it requires giving up the advantage, let him go. There will be another mission, another formation, another opportunity. Survival itself becomes part of the weapon. Because every American pilot who returns tomorrow carries everything he learned today back into the sky. Every experienced man who survives can teach the next replacement. Every pilot who refuses one bad fight preserves months of training that would otherwise vanish in seconds. And as the war continues, that difference begins to compound. The Japanese are losing experienced aircrew faster than those years of experience can be recreated. The Americans are moving in the opposite direction. New pilots arrive. They fly beside veterans. They survive. They learn. Then they become the veterans standing beside the next group. The balance does not change in one spectacular battle. It changes one returned aircraft at a time, one surviving pilot at a time, one mission where the zero never gets the fight it wants. There is another reason this matters, one that does not show up on a victory board. Every time a lightning pilot refuses a bad fight, he is forcing the enemy to spend something he cannot easily replace. Fuel, altitude, attention, nerve. A zero pilot who climbs after a P-38 gives up the protective position he had over the bombers below. A pilot who turns to chase one attacker may expose his wingman to another. A formation that scatters to avoid the first diving pass may survive the moment and still fail the mission it came to complete. That is how a tactical advantage becomes something larger. The Americans are no longer asking only, can we shoot him down? They are beginning to ask, can we make him abandon what he came here to do? The difference is enormous. A fighter does not have to be destroyed to be defeated. Drive it away from the bombers it was supposed to escort, and the bombers are suddenly alone. Force it low, and it may no longer have the altitude to intersect the wave. Make its pilot burn fuel, climbing toward a threat that refuses to come down, and every minute of that chase shortens the time he can remain over the battlefield. A 38 high above a formation can change the shape of a mission before its guns ever fire. That is why the Lightning's greatest advantage is not simply speed. Speed can be measured. Altitude can be measured. Horsepower can be written on a specification sheet. Discipline cannot. Discipline is the moment a pilot sees a tempting target below and chooses not to attack because the angle is wrong. It is the moment he feels an enemy turning beneath him and refuses to follow. It is the decision to climb away while part of him still wants proof that the aircraft he just fired on is actually going down. For Bong, that restraint becomes almost invisible from the outside. The scoreboard records the kills. It does not record the attacks he refuses, the turns he does not make, the targets he lets go because reaching them would cost too much energy. Yet those decisions are part of the record too. 40 victories are not only 40 successful attacks. They are also hundreds of moments in which he survives long enough to make another one. And that may be the hardest lesson for the young pilots arriving behind him to accept. The heroic image of a fighter pilot is a man who stays in the fight until the enemy breaks. The Lightning teaches the opposite. Leave while you still own the advantage. Come back only when the geometry belongs to you again. The goal is not to prove courage in every encounter. The goal is to return tomorrow with your experience intact, your aircraft intact, and one more lesson to pass to the pilot flying beside you. Over New Guinea, that lesson accumulates, slowly at first, then all at once, again. But there is one more consequence, harder to measure and photograph. The Lightning changes what an American pilot believes is possible. A year earlier, men entered combat carrying warnings about the zero. Do not let it behind you. Do not turn with it. Do not expect to survive if the fight slows down. By 1943, those warnings are still true, but they no longer sound like a sentence. They sound like instructions. Stay fast. Stay high. Work with your wingman. Make the enemy climb. Make him react. Suddenly, survival is not a matter of hoping the zero makes a mistake. It is something a pilot can build deliberately, one decision at a time. That shift matters because confidence changes behavior. Pilots who believe they possess a way out are less likely to panic when an attack goes wrong. They are more willing to break contact, reform, and try again. They stop measuring courage by how long they remain tangled with the enemy. They begin measuring professionalism by whether the squadron comes home together. The transformation is quiet but enormous. The P-38 does not merely give them a weapon. It gives them a method, and a method can be taught. And that is perhaps the most important thing about the P-38. It is not unbeatable. No aircraft is. It does not magically turn every American pilot into a better fighter pilot than every Japanese opponent. It does something more useful. It gives a disciplined pilot the ability to refuse many of the contests in which the enemy holds the advantage. The zero still turns tighter. That fact never changes. It simply begins to matter less, because the greatest strength in the world is useless if the enemy never allows you to use it. By April 1944, Bong has passed 26 confirmed victories, the record set by Eddie Rickenbacker a full generation earlier, in the skies over France in the First World War. He is 23 years old, and the war for him is not yet finished. By the autumn of 1944, Richard Bong is no longer simply a pilot with a growing tally of victories. He has become something closer to a symbol, the living proof that an idea born years earlier on a drawing board in Burbank had been right all along. He does not seem entirely comfortable carrying it. He is 24 years old now, still quiet, still the same young man who once insisted his own marksmanship was nothing special, that he simply flew close enough that missing wasn't an option. The army has other plans for him. He is pulled from frontline combat duty and reassigned as a gunnery instructor, sent to teach younger pilots the discipline that has kept him alive through nearly 2 years of exactly this kind of war. His orders are specific. Train others. Defend yourself if attacked. Do not go looking for a fight. He reads that instruction as loosely as any order he has ever been given. Over the Philippines, in the final months of 1944, he keeps flying, keeps climbing above formations he was never ordered to engage, keeps adding mission by mission to a total that will eventually reach 40 enemy aircraft, destroyed every single one of them in the same aircraft, flown the same disciplined way. No American pilot before him, or since, has ever matched that number. In December, on the airfield at Tacloban, General Douglas MacArthur pins the Medal of Honor to Bong's chest. He sets aside his prepared remarks to do it. The words he uses that day will follow Bong for the rest of his short life, a young man from a small dairy farm outside Poplar, Wisconsin, now described as the man who ruled the air from New Guinea to the Philippines. The citation does not honor a single mission. It honors weeks of a war. Bong was never required to keep fighting an instructor who kept climbing back into the sky anyway, and shot down 8 more aircraft in the process. And then, with the record secured beyond any reasonable argument, General Kenny does something almost unheard of in this war. He sends him home for good. Bong returns to the United States in January 1945. He marries Marjorie Vattendahl, the young woman whose name and photograph he had carried on the nose of his Lightning through most of the Pacific campaign. He takes a new job, test pilot for Lockheed, the same company where, years earlier, an engineer named Kelly Johnson had first sketched the strange twin-tailed shape that would carry Bong through 40 confirmed victories, without ever once losing him to the enemy. The war in the Pacific is not yet finished, but for Richard Bong, the fighting is over. He believes that. Everyone around him believes that. On the morning of August 6th, 1945, half a world away, a single American bomber releases a single bomb over the city of Hiroshima. At almost exactly the same hour, in California, Richard Bong climbs into the cockpit of a new aircraft. Not a Lightning, a jet, the P-80, one of the first of its kind, the beginning of an entirely new era of flight that the P-38 itself had helped make possible. He takes off from the Lockheed field. The engine fails almost immediately. He is too low, moments later, for his parachute to open. America's ace of aces, the man who survived 40 separate encounters with an enemy that once seemed unbeatable, is killed at the age of 24, not in combat, not by a Zero, but by the very machine built to replace the one that had made him a legend. Thomas Maguire, the pilot who spent nearly 2 years chasing Bong's record without ever quite catching it, does not live to see the war's end either. In January 1945, over the Philippines, he breaks the one rule he had spent years teaching to every pilot under his command. trying to help a wingman caught in a low, slow turning fight, the exact kind of fight the Lightning was never built to accept. He holds onto his drop tanks too long, loses too much speed, and stalls at an altitude with no room left to recover. He dies with 38 confirmed victories, second only to Bong, 4 short of the record he had wanted, by every account, more than almost anything else in this war. He is killed in the end, not by a better pilot, by the one mistake he always warned others never to make. There is a strange symmetry in how this story closes. 2 young Americans, 23 and 24 years old, who proved beyond any argument that an idea refuse the dogfight, fight in the vertical, never turn, could dismantle an enemy air force that had once seemed unbeatable. Both of them within 7 months of each other. Neither dies the way this story would have written it, if this were fiction instead of history. One in a training accident, on American soil, in a machine meant to carry the future of flight forward. The other in the one kind of fight he had spent 2 years telling other men never to enter. The idea itself outlives them both. Vertical combat altitude and speed over the close turn, the discipline of striking from above and refusing to be dragged down the enemy's terms becomes, in the years that follow, the foundation of jet-age air combat, taught in training programs from the earliest jet fighters straight through to the aircraft flying today. Kelly Johnson, the engineer who first sketched that strange twin-tailed shape on a drawing board in Burbank, goes on to lead the design of the U-2 and the SR-71 Blackbird aircraft, built on the same conviction that shaped the Lightning from the very beginning. Reach the fight from a place the enemy cannot follow, and the fight is already half won before it begins. Richard Bong lies today in a small cemetery in Poplar, Wisconsin, the same quiet farm town where his story started, before any of this, before Buna, before the Medal of Honor, before a jet engine failed on a California runway. In 2024, a search team locates the wreckage of his Lightning, the aircraft he named Marge, after the woman he married in a jungle ravine in New Guinea. The red paint on the wingtips is still visible. Thomas Maguire has an Air Force base in New Jersey named in his honor, carrying his memory forward into a country that, for the most part, has long since forgotten both of their names. And here is the part of this story worth saying plainly, without the exaggeration that so many retellings reach for. The Lightning did not win the Pacific Air War alone. Navy and Marine fighters, the Hellcat, the Corsair, shot down more Japanese aircraft over the course of the war than the P-38 ever did. What the Lightning did, better than any other aircraft of its time, was prove that an idea most fighter pilots had considered unthinkable could actually work. That refusing to fight on the enemy's terms was not cowardice. It was the only path that led home. America built a fighter that refused to dogfight, and one by one, mission by mission, over a jungle coastline, most Americans back home could not have found. On a map, the zero began to die.